welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. I'm Brennan Breed. Today, we continue our study of the book of Ezekiel. We're going to look at the first three chapters, which often are called the Call of Ezekiel. We're going to be looking at one of the strangest chapters in the Bible, and one that has provoked a lot of really interesting reflections. Some songs even. I think Journey has a song, Wheels in the Sky Keep on Turning. The wheels within wheels. There's a lot of quite fascinating reflections that involve space aliens, hallucinogenic drugs, the afterlife, the apocalypse. This has fostered a wide range of interpretations. I'm going to give you my interpretation today. I don't claim that it's the only one or necessarily the right one. I'm trying my best to understand within the context of the ancient Near East, but also within the whole context of Ezekiel and who he is and his entire book. If you read the whole book of Ezekiel closely, you'll notice that this strange figure of the wheels within wheels with the four creatures around it actually recurs 3 times. And within the book of Ezekiel, these 3 occurrences basically structured the book. And all 3 occurrences refer to the other times. So they didn't have chapters and verses in the ancient world, but the first 3 chapters, Ezekiel has this vision by the river Kibar, which is really a canal, as I described last time. In chapters 8 through 10, there's a second vision that talks about the wheels within wheels and the angels, and it says, like I had seen by the river Kibar. So it's basically saying, refer to chapters 1 through 3. And then in chapters 40 through 48, which finish the book of Ezekiel, there's a third vision of this wheels within wheels chariot thing. And it comes back, and it says, like I saw by the river Kibar and like I saw in Jerusalem, which is where he spiritually is seeing what's happening in chapters 8 through 10. So chapters 1 through 3, and then chapters 8 through 10, and then chapters 40 through 48 create this kind of arc that structured the book of Ezekiel as a whole. And within that, and also taking a look at what these things might have represented in the ancient world and within the Bible, I've got my own argument of what I think is happening here, and it involves the Ark of the Covenant. So we'll get to that today. So just to remind us, we're studying the prophets of the Exile. So we took a look at Jeremiah, we're moving on to Ezekiel, and then we'll move on to 2nd Isaiah, and that is Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. And we are looking at the ways that the displacement and honestly the terror, the trauma that these folks lived through informed their ministry, their vocation, their prophecy, the way that they spoke to their people. So the Word of God, what was the Word of God to a people who were displaced, who were distraught, and who were trying to reimagine a new life? So if that describes you at all, and thinking about these questions of who, what, when, why, where, how, all these huge questions that such a traumatic event would bring up, I remain eternally grateful that theologians like Ezekiel thought hard about the questions that were put in front of them and responded as faithfully as they possibly could. And Ezekiel and Jeremiah actually have some differences, and we'll get into that a bit today. I'll try to explain some of Ezekiel's priestly background. Now, Jeremiah was a priest too, but he was a priest of Anatot, a priest of a line that had long been banned from serving in Jerusalem at the temple. Ezekiel was a priest in the line of Zadok, we imagine. I say this because Ezekiel talks about the Zadokites at the end of the book. The Zadokites were a particular kind of priests, and they were the priests whose line led to the high priest. Zadok was one of the first high priests of the temple. In fact, Zadok's the other first high priest, there were co-high priests at the beginning, was Abiathar, this guy who was exiled to Anatot, that is Jeremiah's great-great-great ancestor. So Ezekiel's great-great-great-granddad and Jeremiah's great-great-great-granddad were both serving in the temple at the same time, and Jeremiah's ancestor got kicked out, whereas Ezekiel's remained high priest, Zadok, and in fact, that line of high priests was high priests, or at least they claimed to have been kind of an unbroken lineage all the way up until about the year 175 BC. That's another story altogether for another day, but just to say Ezekiel's part of this lineage that we would call the high priests family, this lineage that we might call the Zadokites. There were different kind of families or clans within the priesthood. You might be reading the Psalms and see something about the Ezrahites. You think about the Levites being kind of a large group that encompasses all priests, which it might have been. But the Levites are often referred to as kind of a subset of the priests within the book of Numbers, let's say. So all to say that there's a complicated relationship between these different priestly groups. And the Ezekiel probably comes from this one group that was on top. So Ezekiel represents a very particular theological vantage point, one that we can see is thoroughly kind of soaked in the theology of the book of Exodus. I'm sorry, of the second half of Exodus, starting with Exodus 25 to Exodus 40. Which is the part of Exodus that people tend to skip over, or these Christians, and then the whole book of Leviticus. This is part of what we would call the priestly materials in the Bible. So the second half of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. We'll talk a little bit about that today, and I'll refer to it throughout the rest of our study of Ezekiel. So the first thing to think of here is priests, right? So all ancient cultures that we have record of have something like priests, holy people who tend to come from particular families that represent or mediate in some way God's presence. And by mediating, I mean that they do things, they manipulate things. The blood of animals, sacrifice was a very common thing to see in almost all ancient cultures. So blood sacrifice, animal sacrifice, incense sacrifice that is burning particular kind of smells, using certain odors to represent God's presence. And priests oftentimes were linked to one particular deity. Now remember, almost all ancient people were polytheistic. They had lots of gods that they worshipped, but the priest would represent one god. So the priestesses of Ishtar of Arbela. Arbela was a city in ancient Assyria, and today it's the city Erbil in Syria. And the people who worked at that temple, the priests at that temple, the priestesses at the temple, and by the way, it was very common for there to be women priests or men priests, and these folks would do things, manipulate things, rituals, sacred objects, and so on, and they would teach people things. They would in fact do a lot of the things that we associate with clergy today. They would give people oracles, that they would tell them what to do. They would tell people kind of ethical or sometimes ritual advice. Here's what you're supposed to do if you have a baby, let's say, or here's what you're supposed to do if here's our, if you're an Israelite, you'd say, here's our circumcision ritual, if it's a boy that you've had, and so on. You would kind of teach people about how to do things, and then you would perform these rituals and these rites. Sometimes priests would give like a response, a kind of pastoral care, we might say, to a crisis, either a national crisis or a personal crisis or a communal crisis. So priests would do all kinds of things, and they would, by the way, take care of buildings and grounds. So if you're a pastor or a priest and you're listening to this, you might say, wow, that sounds a lot like my job today. And in fact, it is. So these Israelite priests also had what we would call a symbolic worldview. Now, that might sound like I'm demeaning what they talked about or what they said, but a symbolic worldviews, like a worldview would be like how I see the world or how I understand the world. All worldviews are symbolic. People use language to understand the world. That's the way human beings are created. All of us do this. When Jesus was, on this earth, when he was talking to people, let's say in Galilee, he had to use language that people could understand. He had to use metaphors that people could understand. He had to point to stuff that was common to them and say, God's like this or God's like that. He had to kind of, in a way, condense his ideas into a particular culture, into a particular symbolic worldview. And there's no way for humans to get out of this. We all have this. And there's one thing that's interesting about Christianity is that we say that there's no one particular worldview that's right or correct, that Christ can inhabit and move through and God can work through all of them. So that's why, let's say, folks who work for a Christian church in a different culture, when I say different from mine, not in the U.S. or something like that, and they might read an English translation of the scriptures and say the Lamb of God, and they might say, we don't have lambs here. No one eats lamb here. No one knows what a lamb is, right? And we don't have that stuff around here. They might have to translate, right? These ideas that are kind of central to ancient Near Eastern ideas or theology and so on, and you might have to translate them to a different culture for it to make sense, right? Well, in that same way, Israelite priests inhabited a particular symbolic worldview, the worldview of ancient Near Eastern priests. And sometimes what they did was pretty similar to the priests of other nations around them, and sometimes what they did was different. So in order to figure out what's different, it's nice to know like what actually is pretty common. That's one of the things we're going to try to get into today is to talk about this worldview. Just to kind of, as an entree into this, I'll point to Leviticus chapter 10, which if you haven't read it, is a pretty crazy chapter. It's part of the section of Leviticus. If you think of Leviticus as a book that is not intended for you, it actually helps, right? Everyone who I've ever known who's tried to read Leviticus says, I don't get it. This is hard. Every Read the Bible Through in a Year program crash lands in the book of Leviticus and people just stop reading, right? But if you think of Leviticus as a manual for ancient priests that helped them to help people like you, that is common people. I'm common. I'm not ordained, so I would be a common person. And that's not a mean thing or a bad thing to say. It's just that's the way it was. There were holy people and common people. Leviticus chapters 8 through 10 is all about ordination rites. How do you ordain a priest? And chapter 10 kind of finishes the stuff about ordination by telling a story about two sons of Aaron who offered strange fire on the altar and who died. And this story is intended for priests to tell them, hey, this stuff's important. Take these rules seriously. And a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament where God it seems like kind of God gets mad and kind of kills people for like touching the ark, right? This guy Uzzah, who like touches the ark in the book of 1 Samuel, tries to like stop it from like falling over when it kind of hits like a pothole or something. They're moving the ark from one place to another, and he tries to help it. This is in the part of 1 Samuel where this is actually 2 Samuel. I'm sorry, 2 Samuel 5, I think, or 6, where they're moving the ark up into Jerusalem. But in any event, so Uzzah tries to stop the ark from falling. He touches it, and he dies. And this sounds like God hates Uzzah, and like, is God's looking like angry God's looking to kill someone for not following the rules or something. One way to think about what's happening in stories like Leviticus 10 or the story of Uzzah in 2 Samuel is to think about holiness. So holiness, people use that word to mean a lot of things today, but in the ancient world, it just meant God. God is holy, holy is God. Holiness is something that's like close to God or near God or to be used by God. And whatever properties God has, holiness has. So it doesn't just mean like, I don't know, staying away from drinking or something like that or smoking. It wasn't that. Holiness in the ancient world had less to do with kind of ethics, although ethics were part of it, but it had less to do with ethics and more to do with just space. Like what are you near? Are you near God? Then you should be holy. That is something that's set aside. Think about holiness like this, something that's set aside for God's special use. God is holy, and anything that God uses in a close way, in a particular way, needs to be holy too. So if you think of holiness as like almost like a power, like an energy that emanates from God, and so then anything that is holy is something that like almost like God's energy is flowing through. Think of it as like a live wire. So think of God as like maybe like a nuclear power plant, right? God is powerful and dangerous, and God is not something that you want to mess with. If you think about God that way, then you might kind of think, God being near us is amazing. And this is what Exodus 25 says, by the way. So Exodus 1 through 24 is God freeing the Israelites, bringing them out from oppression under Pharaoh, giving them the law at Sinai, the covenant, the relationship that God makes with them. And then Exodus 25 through 40, the part that no one reads, is all about creating a space for God in the midst of the people. And the big question in Exodus 25 is, how is a holy God, who is the kind of font of all of the energy and power in the universe, right? God, who is the source of, incredible source of energy, right? And power and might and all this stuff. How is a person supposed to stand next to God? How can God be in proximity to us in any way and not destroy us? Not because God's mad, but just because God's powerful. God is so powerful that like all the nuclear explosions in the universe added up are nothing compared to God, right? So how are we supposed to, an unholy people, and not unholy like evil necessarily, we're just we're mortals. We have skin and flesh and bones, and we're made of mud, right? Like we are just things in this world, and we're animated by God's Spirit, right? But at the same time, we still are things. We run into these limitations every time we try to get over the edge of 40. We try to run, right? Like our knees hurt, our backs hurt. We feel the limitations of our body all the time, and in that way we have an issue, right? How are we going to be close to God? So God says in Exodus chapter 25, I'll just read this real quick because it's super important. This is before the building of the sanctuary. God says to Moses, have them, this is verse 8, by the way, of Exodus 25, have them make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. And then God tells them how to make the Ark of the Covenant, the lampstand, that is the menorah, the tabernacle with like the curtains and everything else. And so it goes into great detail because it's almost like a nuclear power plant, and that you have to build this thing really in a special way in order to keep it safe for everyone to come visit. Right? Like just like you gotta have like all the manuals correct to run a power plant, right? And if the people who ran the power plant kind of like are like, hey, anyone can come in here, let's not have like tight rules. Let's like just loosen up and have fun, right? Let's just be all about letting anyone who in here who wants to see it, right? Someone walks in, pushes the wrong button, and the place explodes, right? It's not because the nuclear energy is mad at people, or it's bad or something, or it's but it's simply because it's just it's pure energy, raw energy. And we want it to power our lights, and it's a good thing to have that energy from a nuclear power plant. In the same way, it's a good thing to have God living in the midst of people. At the same point in time, it is really dangerous to do that. I mean, think about the C.S. Lewis quote, right, from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Is Aslan the lion / Jesus good? Yes. Is he safe? No, not really safe, but good, right? So in the same way, think of the priests as the people who run the power plant in the ancient world, right? The source of divine energy, and how they have to help people know the rules. So that's why Leviticus is so boring. It's a manual for running an ancient power plant. And there's certain core ideas for how the power works. And there's really two main ideas. The first one is holiness. And the opposite of holiness is not unholiness. And I mean, it is, I guess, but like that doesn't mean anything we mean by saying unholy, right? Just tell you that's unholy. It means it's bad. The opposite of holiness in the ancient world, not just for Israelites, by the way. Egyptians believed this, and Mesopotamians believed this, and Hittites believed this. This was a very common thing in the ancient world, which is why I think God uses it. God's speaking the language that people already understand, right? Abram and Sarah, they understand this kind of thinking. So in any event, this is God is speaking them in a way they can understand. So in the ancient world, there was a core idea that holiness was the opposite of commonness. This pen that I have in my hand is common. It's not holy. It's not set aside for God's special purpose in any way. It's my pen. I'm a common guy and I use it. It's not bad. It's not evil. It's not missing something. It's just what it's supposed to be. It's good. It's just common. It's not holy. God, it's not supposed to go in the temple. Right? Stuff that's supposed to go in the temple, like here you see a medieval manuscript from a Jewish European Jewish artist, and you see menorah there, and you see the different implements that are found in the temple, the menorah being the big lampstand. This stuff has to be holy. It has to be set aside for God's special use. That doesn't mean it's perfect. Stuff like the menorah was made by a person. You'll see the second half of Exodus. There's a lot of references to these guys, Bezalel and Oholiab. They're just dudes. They're people who are gifted at arts, at making beautiful things, but they're not perfect. They're just people like you and me, and they're tasked with making the stuff that's going to go in the temple. So the stuff that goes holy doesn't mean perfect. For God, it means God's perfect, but holy things are just things that are put in God's presence. Or you can think of holy days, holidays, right? Like the Sabbath. Right? Like Passover, like Pentecost, right? These are holy days that repeat on the calendar that are set aside for God's special use in the world. Or you can think of holy people, the priests, people who are set aside for God's special work in the world, to mediate God's presence to other people and so on. You can think about holy objects like the menorah that go in the temple, holy space, like the temple itself, or the tabernacle before the temple was built. The tabernacle being like a sanctuary, a place for God to live. It's God's house. The temple is God's house. And in fact, the word that's used to refer to the temple in the Bible is the same word that's used to refer to a palace, a heichal. It eventually ends up having the technical sense of temple, but it really just means palace. That's God's palace. Just like a king has a palace, God has a palace. God's our king. God has a palace. So the temples have a holy of holies, right? Like we talk about this like it's special for the ancient Israelites. It's not. Every temple has a holy of holies. It's the most holy space. It's the space that's reserved for God. It's God's bedroom, right? There's usually like a courtyard outside of a temple where people can come and sacrifice and commune with God. It's like welcoming someone to your front yard. Or your backyard. And then there's the sanctuary itself, which has a big open space, and that's where like the showbread is, right? You have guests over, you give them a little bit of food. So this is kind of the big inside space of the temple, and it's used for hosting, kind of like your living room, hosting people to come over inside your house. And holier people are allowed in there, so only priests are allowed to go inside. And then there's the Holy of Holies, that is the most holy place. Kind of like the Song of Songs is like the best song. That's a way to kind of say a superlative in ancient Hebrew, but also in other Semitic languages, is like the something of somethings, the Holy of Holies, the Song of Songs, the songiest of all songs. But in any event, saying the Holy of Holies just means the holiest place, and it means God's bedroom. It's where God dwells, where God lives. So if we think about holiness as being the opposite of commonness, a common space is like my house right now. It's a common space. It's not ordained, or it's not dedicated to God. You can pour oil on things and make them holy if in certain rituals. They have to kind of fit certain preconceived notions of what a holy object would be. Like a menorah has to look like a lampstand, and you're told what it's supposed to look like in Exodus chapter 25. But if you follow all the rules and then you pour oil on something, the verb there is mashach. That's where Messiah comes from, Mashiach. This is to Messiah something means to pour oil on it, to set it aside for God's special use. And in the ancient, in the Old Testament, this can be anything. It doesn't have to be a person. This could be an object or whatever. And priests were Messiahed. They had an oil poured on them, and they were anointed to do God's special work. They were made sacred or made holy. So by the time of Jesus, this word means something special. Mashiach ends up meaning something different. It means the very special person that we are expecting to fix the world in a way. But in the Old Testament, you can use that word to mean a king, or like a king who has a special task set aside by God for them. But it's used to refer to all kinds of people. It's used to refer to King Cyrus of the Persians in the book of Isaiah. And we'll get to that, in fact, in a few weeks. Okay, so all to say, holiness and commonness is a big kind of... those are two very different ideas, but they're linked, right? There's another kind of set of ideas, and that's purity and impurity, sometimes translated as clean and unclean. And let me tell you what, this one is abused a lot. So that is to say, I'm unclean. A lot of Christians will use this to kind of belittle Judaism, to talk about how Jews in Jesus's day were being mean to people by saying they were unclean. It was kind of like the untouchable caste or something like that. That's not what we're talking about here. First of all, the term doesn't really have anything to do with cleanliness. The temple was a dirty space. It had animal blood all over it, right? But it was ritually clean. So this is about ritual purity more than it has to do with cleanliness. It doesn't have to do with disease or early understandings of like viruses. It doesn't have anything to do with that, right? It's just this idea that lots of ancient people shared, not just ancient Israelites, that there were certain things, certain items, objects, animals, classes of animals, and so on, that were more pure, and certain things that were impure. And there's two very different kinds of purity and impurity. Unfortunately, they use the same Hebrew word for them. But we're going to start with the class that's more important to the priests, at least initially. And that's ritual purity and impurity. So something can be ritually pure or ritually impure, and it has nothing to do with ethics. It has nothing to do with morals. It has nothing to do with good or bad. So a certain kind of animal, a pig, is ritually impure. It's not bad. It's not a bad animal. God made it. God made it to do certain things. It's just ritually impure. So it should be used for certain things and not used for other things. It should be certain places and not other places, right? So this idea of ritual purity means when you want to bring something into a holy space, and really it's only then that this is a problem. If you want to bring something into a holy space, or if you want to go into a holy space, you need to think about ritual purity. If you are ritually impure, it's not a problem, unless you want to go to the temple or go to an altar, and so on. If you want to get close to something holy or go into a holy space, or even get close to a holy person like a priest, then you have to think about issues of ritual purity. But most people in ancient Israel, in fact, all people, would be ritually impure from time to time, and it wasn't a bad thing. They were expected to be that way. So, for example, bodily emissions like blood or semen are thought to be ritually impure. This is not bad. Blood's not bad. Blood's good. Childbirth is good. So, anyone who has sex, it becomes ritually impure. Women who have a baby become ritually impure. Having a baby is a wonderful thing in ancient Israelite religion. They love it. It's to be celebrated as a great thing. But also there's ritual impurity involved. Again, ritual impurity is not immoral. It's not bad to the person. It doesn't degrade them at all. It just means don't come to the temple for a little bit. You can get rid of this by washing with water and waiting a certain amount of days, and there's kind of rituals to go along with bringing someone from ritual impurity into ritual purity. Other categories of things that are ritually impure are like skin diseases, sometimes called leprosy, but it's a very different disease than contemporary understandings of leprosy. It's like eczema. I mean, I have some eczema on my finger. I would not have been allowed to go in the temple like this. I would have had to have somehow tried to fix it, or just know that I'm just going to be in a state of ritual impurity. So certain skin diseases, especially eczema, not all skin diseases, just things that kind of make it look like, and in the Old Testament they reference this a few times, it makes you look like you're dead. Makes you look like you're dying. It's kind of like your skin is dying. This is something that they said, no, you can't come into the temple. That makes you ritually impure. So bleeding, issues of birth and sex, and skin diseases keep you out. It's things like that. And recently, a bunch of scholars have noticed, Jacob Milgram being key among them, scholars who have taken Leviticus seriously and try to think about what it means. They say, okay, look, these are all issues of life and death. The birth of a child, sex, touching a dead body, right? And things like skin diseases that are associated with death. These things are all about life and death. Ritual purity and impurity has to do with the powers of life and death. And ritual impurity is, again, not evil, not bad. It's just something that kind of it's a representative of death in some way. Or it's representative of people generating life, like the birth of a child. A woman becomes ritually impure, not because she's bad or it's a joyous thing, but also that woman has just generated life. And in order to recognize that the power of life doesn't come from us, we need to stay out of the temple for a little bit and let our powers recede, powers to generate life recede for a bit, and then we can go into the temple. Again, it's an ancient idea. It's not a contemporary idea. It's part of a fabric of ancient life that may seem strange to us. By the way, I have an ancient mikvah or bath here. Ancient Jewish bathing practices develop as a way of kind of trying to represent this ritual cleanliness. You can see this reflected in lots of different religions and different cultures in the ancient world and in the modern world. But it's just really important to know that it's contagious, that ritual impurity is contagious. So if I touch a dead body and then I touch a priest, that priest has got a problem. The priest isn't considered evil. The priest just can't go into the temple for a little bit. Or there'll be this kind of like conflicting powers between ritual impurity, which represents the powers of death, and holiness, which represents the powers of life. It's kind of like a short circuit. You don't want to touch the two different wires together, or you might make an explosion happen, right? So the priests tell you it's okay if you bury a dead body. In fact, it's what you're supposed to do. Take care of people and represent their life well with a funerary monument, and remember them and take care of their body and show them honor in that way, and then stay away from the temple for a few days and then come back. So in any event, this is very different from what we would call moral purity and impurity, which sometimes also is called purity or impurity in the Bible. So unfortunately, these are confusing ideas, but this is very different. Moral impurity comes from human hearts. It doesn't come from the forces of death. It might involve death. But moral impurity is really bad stuff that you do, and it generates kind of an evil power. So murdering someone. Here's Cain and Abel, right? Murder, kind of horrible things that you say that hurt other people is something that could be called moral impurity. Terrible, like using someone else for sex or using them in some other way that demeans them. That would generate moral impurity. Oppressing other people is part of moral impurity. These impurities are disgusting to God, and they tend to kind of accumulate in the temple. The temple has an altar which has horns on it, and those horns are like lightning rods that attract moral impurities that would otherwise pollute the land and pollute the people. So think about it like when you do something bad, it generates this evil power. And that evil power then goes to the temple. And the priests at the temple are cleaning the horns of the altar with blood. The blood of animals. That's what sacrifices do. They clean the horns of the altar. The reason that they do this is it's actually quite simple. In the ancient world, not just in Israel, but in Egypt and Babylon, and the Hittite cultures, lots of ancient cultures shared this idea that animal blood is like a ritual detergent. It cleans ritual stuff, ritual spaces, ritual objects like the altar. And it has power, the power of life to overcome death. So, and I know it involves death. It's it's a big, broad metaphor with some complexity to it, right? But all to say that the moral impurities of the people gather to the horns of the altar, and the priests are washing and cleaning. And in ancient Israel, this is actually different than the peoples around them. The peoples around them thought that. So, say for example, in Babylon, they had a ritual that went along with their annual New Year's festival, and we have this ritual, like we've got records of it, and this was called the Akitu Festival. So the preparations for the Akitu Festival in Babylon involved basically dousing the walls of the temples with blood, animal blood, to try to clean demons out of the space. In ancient Israel, if you read Leviticus carefully, it's not about cleaning demons away. It's about claiming our own culpability. The people bring their own animals to the temple, and they say, I did this thing, this bad thing, this morally impure thing, or I generated ritual impurity and I brought it into a holy space, right? I did something that's bad, and I want to make up for it. And I brought this animal here to make up for it. And so then the priest would take the blood of the animal and clean the altar. So it's a way of claiming responsibility, individual and corporate responsibility for things we've done. And then the top of the altar is a barbecue grill. They got coals on it and a grate, and they would they would butcher the animal, put it on top of the altar, and they would cook it. And then you'd share that meal with the priest and with other people you had wronged, because you had to kind of do restitution for the things that you had done that were bad. That was part of this ritual. You had to make up for the stuff you did, not just say, my bad, I'm sorry. You had to make up for the things you did, and then bring this animal, sacrifice it, and then have a meal, a reconciliation meal, with the people you offended and with the priest, and that was a celebration. And so it was a way to reintegrate people into society. So it's it actually is kind of a beautiful thing in some ways. All to say that this system of ritual impurity, moral impurity, think of it this way. When you do something that's terribly morally impure, you generate that impurity. If you do the right rituals, you can kind of convert it to ritual impurity and get rid of it with the blood of an animal on the horns of the altar. But you got to do the other steps too, like confess it publicly, tell the people that you've wronged, make up for it, right? Actually do restitution. So in any event, that's it's a larger question, larger issue. But just think of it like this. I'm going to move my head here. Okay. So you've got these different ideas, right? The pure and the impure, and holy and common. And just think of it like this. The pure things and holy things, they're green. They go together just fine, right? Pure things and holy things are great. Impure and common things, they're fine. I got a little yellow line here because kind of like a yellow light, you got to stop and think for a moment. If you're impure and you're common, let's say that you've just buried a relative who's died, you've touched their body. Okay, that's made you ritually impure, and you're a common person, not a holy person like me. This is okay. This is not bad. It doesn't hurt you. But you shouldn't go into the temple. That's the yellow light, right? Do you need to go into the temple? Yeah, that's going to be rough. But otherwise, you're fine. Something that's common and pure, that's like a different shade of yellow, because it's like, well, you could go into the temple then. You still got to watch out. You can't go all the way into the Holy of Holies or something, right? I mean, there are rules you got to follow. But if you're common and you're pure, there's certain spaces in the temple area that you can go into, the courtyard, let's say. If you're impure, in a state of impurity, and you want to go into a holy space, or if you're a holy person and you want to go into a holy space and you've contracted ritual impurity or moral impurity, this is a bad thing. You got to watch out. You could cause that short circuit, like in Leviticus 10, the sons of Aaron who explode, right? So this is the thing you got to watch out for. Now, that's the conceptual, there's a lot more to it. That's the basis of the conceptual world of ancient priests. And now we're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant, one of those ritual objects, because this touches on Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3. So in Exodus 25, Moses starts to tell the people about the holy space, especially the tabernacle, which is basically like a foreshadowing of the temple, and then special implements. And the most important comes first. That's the Ark of the Covenant. And then next is the table of the bread of the presence, or the showbread, and then the lampstand, which is also known as the menorah, and then the tabernacle itself is described. So those are like the most important things, the holiest kind of things. The Ark of the Covenant is really important, not just because, most people would think it has something to do with Indiana Jones, which you can see here. Here's Indiana Jones finding the Ark of the Covenant and pulling it out. You can actually kind of get a sense for what it is by reading about it in Exodus 25. And I bring this up because it's really important for Ezekiel. Okay, so you're supposed to make this thing, this ark, which also kind of means a chest, you can kind of hold something in it. And you're supposed to put these poles to like hold this thing, so you can't really touch the thing, so you can touch the poles that are connected to it, and you kind of carry the poles then. And then you're supposed to make put some things in it. You're supposed to make a mercy seat. There's supposed to be 2 cherubim of gold on this thing. A mercy seat, it just really means a covering. So there's supposed to be a covering on top with 2 cherubim on it. And cherubim are, perhaps you think they're kind of chubby babies with wings, but like a Michelangelo painting, but actually that's a much later thing, and that's actually kind of borrowing from Roman art. The putti are the kind of fat babies with wings that look like angels. But in ancient Israel, a cherubim was, if you kind of read other sources and things, was a human-headed lion with wings. And so these 2 cherubim, it says they kind of stand there with their wings spread out, kind of overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, and they're kind of turned towards each other. And then it says, verse 22, there I will meet with you from above the mercy seat between the 2 cherubim, and I will deliver you all my commands for the Israelites. So it's a place of meeting. That's where God dwells in a way, and it's supposed to be able to move around. So God is mobile here in Exodus 25, which I think is really important. We'll come back to that in a minute. But this Ark of the Covenant is also a space that manifests God's presence, and God is kind of above the cherubim. And other places, like in the Psalms, this is also in 1 Samuel 4, which is a kind of part of the beginning of a story really about the Ark of the Covenant. It says that God is enthroned above the cherubim, or enthroned on the cherubim. That is, that the cherubim kind of form a throne. So this is a kind of a strange thing, perhaps, but this was a common ancient thing, a common ancient theme, to have thrones built out of the bodies of animal-human hybrids that in Israel you'd call a cherubim, or cherub. One of these things, keruv really is the Hebrew word. So this is what you're looking at here. This is a Canaanite carving from the city of Megiddo before it became Israelites. This is a Canaanite carving, and this is a king here, and the king is kind of drinking out of a bowl, and he's seated on a cherubim. So you see that it's a lion body, wings, head of a person, and there's one on either side. So the wings, like one wing is kind of like the side of the chair, and the other wing is forming part of the throne, the base, right? And then on the other side, the other cherubim is doing the opposite, and they form kind of like an actual chair. And this is a pretty common thing. This is a Phoenician king. This is a carving on his tombstone, and you can see that this is again, he's enthroned upon the cherubim. This is yet another this is a Phoenician seal, and you can see that this is actually a goddess who is enthroned on a lion, which is a little bit similar. But this is the throne of Astarte, a Phoenician goddess who is carved here that she is invisibly enthroned upon the cherubim. So there was no statue of Astarte here, of the goddess. She was understood to be enthroned on the cherubim. And you can see there's a wing, there's a lion body, and then it's broken, but that would have been the head of a person here. So all to say that this is a very common Canaanite image, to have a king, some sort of royalty, or a god or goddess enthroned upon the cherubim. Now, these animal-human hybrid creatures were understood, they kind of adorned all of the temple. You can see, if you kind of keep reading, you're supposed to kind of put these beautiful images on the tabernacle, and you can read about it in 1 Kings 8 through 10, where Solomon builds the temple, and it's described that he has cherubim all over the inside of this thing. And these cherubim are, again, animal-human hybrids. They kind of signify holy space in a way, because they're not normal, right? If you walked into a room and you saw a lion with wings and a human head, you'd be like, I am not in Atlanta anymore, right? I am in some other dimension. And that's the basic idea about these animal-human hybrids. So this is what the ark would have actually looked like here, or at least a good suggestion of it. The two cherubim would have been looking at each other, and one wing is going straight up, forming the side, and one wing is going out, forming the base where Yahweh would have been understood to be enthroned, invisibly, right? That Yahweh wouldn't. There's no statue for the God Yahweh in the ancient Israelite temple or in the tabernacle. God is understood to be there, kind of invisibly. And there's a footstool, by the way. It's mentioned. Make a footstool of an enemy and so on. You can see these footstools. I mean, it's because you make a big chair, right? But the king's feet would be dangling like before the king. If you make the throne big enough to be like imposing on to someone who would come up to visit, then you'd have the king's feet dangling. Can't have that because it looks silly, so you have to build this footstool, right, so that the king can be seated up higher. So the Ark of the Covenant had stuff in it, according to Deuteronomy says it has the Ten Commandments in it. In Exodus, we see it has some other stuff in it. There's said to be other things in it in the book of Numbers as well. But ultimately, it's not as much a container as it is a mobile throne for God. That's what it is. And it's really interesting because this mobile throne it emphasizes the mobility of God's ability to move around between the tribes, right? Ancient Israel is a tribal coalition at first. There's no king of Israel for the first few hundred years until King Saul, right? But there's a couple 100-year gap where the tribes have kind of equal footing and God's presence. There's no temple yet. There's no one place that's going to be God's presence. So God kind of circulates around these tribes. And when the tribes come to meet together, the ark would come. So the idea is that God's on the move, right? God doesn't have, Yahweh likes to live in Sinai, in the middle of nowhere. Yahweh's not really interested in being contained in a building or contained in a physical space. Now this changes. When David conquers Jerusalem, David brings the ark and parks it in the temple. And that's basically the last we hear about the ark. It comes out a couple more times that we can hear about a little bit, but really everything after that is legend. It's not really in the Bible. There's legends about Jeremiah having it and hiding it and so on, but that's that we don't really know anything about it after that point. When David parks the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, it's a powerful symbol of David's trying to build a kingdom, a stable kingdom that has a center, a political center, a geographic center. And God's mobility gets subsumed in the kind of stationary temple. So I'll come back to this. But in any event, this is the idea of the temple is, of course, also very ancient. Just as a brief idea, the tabernacle is kind of a mobile thing that can move around. But eventually, David doesn't actually build it. He brings the ark into Jerusalem, and it's Solomon who gets to build the temple. But once the temple is built in Jerusalem, and after it's knocked down, it gets rebuilt again. Of course, the second temple that stood until after the time of Jesus. Temples in Israel and elsewhere drew on a very, very ancient sacred architecture, which had this idea kind of the cosmic mountain or a staircase to heaven. So here you see a ziggurat in what would have been Babylon. Now it's kind of outside of Baghdad, Iraq. But this was the sacred ziggurat of Babylon. And a ziggurat was kind of a giant tower that was built with stairs. Here's kind of a view from the back. It's the top has not been rebuilt. It hasn't been rebuilt entirely. But you can see it's a giant stairway up to heaven. And the idea was that the gods would kind of like go up and ascend and descend from heaven to earth on this thing. Kind of like when you read the vision of the angels ascending and descending in Genesis, right? Jacob's ladder. This shares a little bit with this ancient idea that there were spaces to go up and down. And by the way, what does Jacob do there? He founds a temple, the temple in Bethel. Bethel, by the way, which means Beit El, the house of El. El means God, so it's a temple. Remember, a temple was a house of God or a palace of God. So the city Bethel was an ancient temple that was said in Genesis to be founded by Jacob. And by the way, when in that story in Jacob of Jacob's ladder in Genesis, at the end of it, Jacob gives 10% of all of his stuff to God as a tithe in a way. But also, it's kind of like a hospitality gift, right? God, you welcomed me into your space, and I'm going to give you a nice bottle of wine or something, right? It was a way to kind of give back to God, to thank God for God's hospitality and generosity. So that's basically what a tithe is in a way. These pyramids from ancient Egypt, this is the Step Pyramid. This is at Saqqara, south of Cairo in Egypt. And these ancient pyramids were built to kind of also look like steps, but also like ladders to heaven, but also kind of like mountains, right? And here you can see another view of that Step Pyramid at Saqqara. And next to it was a famous space, kind of like a temple space, a meeting space, really. And you can see there's kind of like waves like on the roof of it. And this was harkening back to a very ancient Egyptian story, which will sound a little bit similar to the Noah story. One of the Egyptian creation stories said that the world emerged out of a chaotic sea that receded, and the first thing to pop out was the cosmic sacred mountain. And that's what the pyramids are trying to kind of remind us of. And every Egyptian temple said it had a little bit of that cosmic sacred mountain in it, and so represented it. That idea of like a cosmic sacred mountain, and that the temple represents it, you can see this in ancient Israel, which we'll get to in a minute, but also you can see it in ancient Babylonian art, Mesopotamian art, Assyrian art. This is an Assyrian wall relief here. And you can see that there's, it's kind of hard to pick it out, but at the top there's a temple and there's a god who's coming out of the temple. I can tell it's a god, hard to see in this drawing, but because this it's a human form that has a hat with horns on it. And the horns, a person with horns in ancient Mesopotamian art signified a god or a goddess. And you can see there's a little altar on the little pathway in front of the person. You can see there's like trees everywhere and like streams and rivers and things. And when you read about the Psalms, when you read about the temple in the Psalms, it'll say something like, I want to stand in God's courts forever and sing God's praise never ending and so on. And it'll sometimes say, like there's a river that flows here, or there's kind of beautiful trees in the courtyard of God, palm trees and things like this, or sacred trees. This is because these temples all throughout the ancient Near East were understood to be part of this kind of sacred cosmic origin mountain, but also they were part of this kind of sacred cosmic garden that, is a bit like the Garden of Eden in a way. This is an ancient myth that's shared throughout lots of ancient cultures. And in ancient Israel, they do something a bit different than other ancient cultures with this myth, but at the same time, it's a story of that the world was once good and kind of beautiful all throughout and fecund, and then something happened, right, to change this. But the temple kind of presents the garden of the gods, right, is one way to think about this. So here's a little image of the temple in Jerusalem, and there's two big pillars there in 1 Kings 8 through 10. There's the description of the temple, and one of these big pillars is named Yakin. The other one's Boaz, or he founded by strength is what that means in Hebrew. It's about the foundation of the cosmos. The big brass sea, the big water container, is called the sea or the ocean, which was a kind of cosmic image of creation in the ancient world. Like in ancient Egypt, I said the cosmic seas recede. There's this kind of cosmic deep in Genesis 1, right? There was just this kind of the deep. I mean, that's water. There's anyway. Well, I can get pretty deep in creation theology, but we'll save that for now. But in any event, the temple represented in a way the cosmos as a whole, and you can see this is a little cross section of what would have looked like according to the Book of Kings, the inside of the temple in Jerusalem, and you can see there's like images of cherubim everywhere. These big cherubim over there. There's two giant cherubim, and then underneath there's the Ark of the Covenant, which is kind of like the seat for God, and that God was understood to kind of in a way live there, dwell there, be present there. That's the Holy of Holies up there, by the way, where the giant cherubim statues are. So this basic idea that God kind of lives in the Holy of Holies, and that the sins of the people kind of attach to the various altars throughout this temple complex, and that the priests take care of the temple by cleansing and cleaning these altars with sacrificed blood brought by animals, donated by people who are trying to make up for their own sins. This is the basic idea, right? The kind of powers, or the power generator of the ancient Israelite universe. This is a little image of the tabernacle, right? The mobile kind of temple-like thing that we hear about in Exodus 25 through 40, the construction of it, but then also in Numbers, this is what they're using to wander through the wilderness and to mediate God's presence all the way through that adventure. One interesting, or maybe not interesting, but interesting to me thing is that the different altars in the temple seem to correspond to different kinds of sins, and like the worse a sin is, the further it penetrates into God's house. And the Ark of the Covenant is in the Holy of Holies, of course, and the worst kinds of offenses like unrepentant murder or something like that. Those sins would attach to the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and those can only be cleansed one day a year on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies. And these are the worst kinds of sins. But you can imagine all these different kinds of sins, kind of stacking up around it's kind of like leaving trash around God's house. And if the sins aren't taken care of in a proper way, then it's kind of like, it's like if a friend moved into your house and then just started leaving trash everywhere. And at first you're like, please pick this up, please pick this up. And then eventually, let's say the trash kind of started to overwhelm the house. I mean, at some point, you might try to kick the friend out. What if the friend gets violent and stuff? You might leave. You might actually walk away from your own house if the situation got bad enough. It has to get dire for you to do that, right? Because it's your house. This is the way God talks about it all throughout the Bible, is that if things get really bad, if the sins of the people get so bad, if the moral impurities of the people that kind of attach all throughout this altar, if they get bad enough, if it makes kind of God's house smell bad enough in a way, God's going to leave. And when God leaves, the house is going to crumble. This is just the way that the priestly sources talk about the fate of Israel. So with that, I think that's crucial for understanding Ezekiel in particular, his way of thinking about the exile. This is his explanation. This is what happened. And we're going to see this come to life over the next couple of weeks. As I mentioned, ritual sacrifice has to do with taking the blood of the animal, of this pure, unblemished animal in a way, and wiping it on the horns of the altar to cleanse off the sins of the people, and then cooking the animal, and then having a feast with it. Here's a real four-horned altar from Beersheba, from the south of Judah. This is from the Iron Age, and just to imagine that this actually happened. So before there was a temple in Jerusalem, there were altars all over the place in Israel, and even after the fact, as testified by the Book of Kings, which keeps saying that all these kings even the kings that wanted to reform, like Hezekiah and Josiah, they had to keep tearing down all these altars everywhere. So there were altars all over the place, some sanctioned, some not sanctioned, etc., throughout the history. So with that in mind, let's do a brief reading of Ezekiel chapter 1. I'm going to come back to this next week. That is to say, there's a lot more to say about this, and this ties together. As I mentioned, Ezekiel chapters 1 through 3 are just the first of 3 visions that Ezekiel has that all tie together and that structure the book. And so we're going to talk a little bit about 1 through 3 today, and then we're going to come back next week and talk about 8 through 10 and 40 through 48. Okay, so the book of Ezekiel starts off with that introduction or the superscription that I mentioned last time. And then remember, Ezekiel's next to a canal, the Kibar Canal, that comes off of the Euphrates River. He's by the city of Nippur in probably the Jewish district of Al-Yehudu. And he looks up, verse 4. He was looking and he saw a stormy wind come out of the north. A great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. You might want to just read chapter 1 and try to picture in your head, what is it that you see? If you haven't read chapter 1, pause it now before I ruin everything for you. But just try to picture this stuff happening in your mind. Go all the way through verse 28. Okay, I'm going to trust that you have read Ezekiel chapter 1 by now. If you look, you'll notice these kind of 4 creatures, right? So verse 8, now you'll have noticed that they are animal-human hybrids, right? Which signify kind of divine presence in a way, right? They're also kind of signify a throne, perhaps, right? Like you're entering a holy space, or you're meeting with God, or perhaps you're even coming to a throne of some sort. So I hope you notice that these creatures can move, right? They can move around. They're mobile. These mobile cherubim-like creatures, right? And they have all these kind of moving abilities, and they can move up and down, and they have wheels, right? So verse 16, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. Now, I don't know what that looks like. It's really interesting. It says, verse 18, their rims were tall and awesome. I have seen some tall and awesome rims on vehicles in my time in Atlanta, but I have never seen one full of eyes all around, so it can see. So the mobility of these creatures is emphasized, and then they rise from the earth. They can fly, so it can go in any direction quickly, and then whatever these creatures are carrying can also fly up into the air. And then verse 20, wherever the Spirit would go, they went. So God's Spirit goes somewhere, and this vehicle flies off, right? And it can go wherever they want, whenever they want. And then over the heads of the living creatures, there was a dome. This is verse 22. A dome shining like crystal spread out above their heads. Over the dome, the wings were stretched out and straight. So a dome over their heads. And then verse 24, when they moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the thunder of the Almighty. So a sound like God is up above, like an army or like a thunderstorm or something like that. And then verse 26, above this dome there was something like a throne. Something like a throne, right? So these animal-human hybrid creatures are mobile and are carrying a throne. Does this sound like something we just talked about, right? Something that seemed like a human form was above. Now, something that seemed like a human form, not a human form, right? This wasn't a throne. It was something like a throne. Upward from what appeared like the loins, or like the midsection of the person, I saw something like gleaming amber, and there was fire all around it. So this being looks like a person, but also looks like a jewel, and also looks like they're flaming fire, right? And then downward, so legs down, saw something that looked like fire, and there was splendor all around. And then verse 28, like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of splendor all around. And the bow, like a bow, and really like Genesis, like Noah's Ark, at the end of there's a rainbow. God puts the rainbow down and says, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to attack the earth again. Literally they understood that to be a divine bow, a weapon, like a bow and arrow bow, right? And God puts the bow down, sort of unilaterally disarming, right? Well, here, this is referenced here, like a bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of the splendor all around. So it's reminding the covenant, right, with the whole earth. And this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Now, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel might have said, and this was the Lord. But he didn't say that. He could have said, this is the glory of the Lord, right? And the glory of the Lord is like a way to say, like, kind of like the shining, like I didn't see God, but I just saw this kind of glorious thing. And this is kind of what, like, Moses. Remember Moses in Exodus 34 gets put in the cleft of the rock, and God covers over Moses' face, and the glory of the Lord passes by. That's because Moses can't look straight at God, because God's like a nuclear reactor. You can't look at it in the middle of a nuclear reactor. You have to have lead shields, and so God shields Moses, right? That was the glory of the Lord. But this wasn't even that Ezekiel saw. Ezekiel didn't see the Lord. He didn't see the glory of the Lord. He saw the likeness of the glory of the Lord, something that looked like the glory, but not even that. The appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel's trying to say, like, there's like 10 layers of distance between Ezekiel and saying this is God, right? So there's something to hang on to there. There's another part to tie in here, and that's that Ezekiel is called mortal, or son of man. See chapter 2, verse 1, God said to me, O mortal, stand on your feet, or O son of man. Son of man just means mortal, the mortal one, the one who's born of a woman, the one who's a person, right? That God's name for Ezekiel is mortal one. This is a way to kind of distance Ezekiel from God. So remember, the priests are all about the glory of the Lord and how dangerous it is, how important it is, how amazing it is, how beautiful it is, how powerful it is, also how dangerous it is. So these layers of distance, it's almost like you can think of Ezekiel kind of distancing himself from saying that he saw anything like God's glory, but also that God is distancing Ezekiel by calling Ezekiel mortal one. In other words, don't get too big for your britches, Ezekiel. You're just a dude. But if we take a step back and think about this kind of wheels within wheels stuff, this, by the way, this image right here, this is an Assyrian wall relief. This is the appearance of the god Asher, the god of Assyria. And like when gods would appear, they would say there was like shining light. There was the sound of like kind of wind rustling. There were like earthquakes. This is the technical term for this is a theophany, an appearance of a divine being. And oftentimes there's like natural disasters that go with the appearance of a divine being, because divine beings are so powerful, right? When they show up on earth, the earth kind of like recoils, or like convulses, earthquakes and eclipses and wind and tornadoes and things like this, right? And so here's Asher appearing with this kind of wings, right? So Asher is mobile. That was what the Assyrian people said, right? It's just something to keep in mind. In art, this has been depicted in many different ways. Here's Raphael depicting the Ezekiel 1, and I don't see any wheels. I see some animals and then some fat, chubby babies. This is definitely not what Ezekiel saw. Sorry. This is a really interesting Irish medieval image. This is from an illuminated manuscript, and you can see like there's the creatures, and then like kind of separate from the creatures that are all kind of mashed together. There's the four wheels that are, I guess that's the wheels within wheels. They're like interlocking. Those wheels are not going to go anywhere. Sorry. Here's another interesting idea for the wheels within wheels, but they're kind of like completely separate from the creatures, and then God's way above all this. I don't know if that's a very good rendition. This one's maybe a little bit better, not exactly right, but here you see the various animals. By the way, these four different animal-human hybrid creatures that are depicted in Ezekiel chapter 1, those are associated later with the four Gospels. But we'll, that's for another time. But see, you can see the wheels here are depicted kind of like wheels kind of surrounding so that you can turn, but it's a mobile throne. This image isn't perfect, depicting what I think is described in Ezekiel 1. But the good part is that this image is showing a throne. It's said to look like a throne, right? So that is, we got a mobile throne. Reminds me of this, the Ark of the Covenant, which was the mobile throne of God. But what's different here is that we have wheels within wheels, so it can move on its own. People don't even have to carry it. People can't carry it. It's going to move on its own. And it can fly through the air. And these creatures are not just like hammered gold or something, right? They're not sculptures. They're actually living creatures that can move of their own accord. And then God's Spirit is part of this thing, making it move as well. So God's mobility. We have basically the Ark of the Covenant 2.0, right? An updated Ark of the Covenant with awesome rims all around. Now think about this from Ezekiel's perspective. He's in exile as he hears this. These questions that are running through Ezekiel's head. Can God, the God that I worship, Yahweh, the God of Israel, who is associated with the mountain of Sinai, who is associated with the wilderness around the area of Judah, who is associated with Jerusalem, who's associated with the areas of Bethel and with Dan in the northern kingdom of Israel, who's even said to do things in places like Phoenicia, like in the Elijah narratives in 1 Kings 17. Yahweh does something in Phoenicia, a miracle. But Babylon? Can Yahweh, the God of the little tiny people of Judah, do anything in Babylon? Those Babylonian gods are said to be very powerful, and the kingdoms that they represent are said to be very, very powerful, right? And they've destroyed Jerusalem. Can Yahweh even get over here? If Yahweh could get over here, what would Yahweh do? Is Yahweh powerful enough does Yahweh care enough to come out here, right? Now that the temple's been destroyed, Yahweh's homeless. So would Yahweh run back to Sinai, maybe the wilderness? Camp out there? The issue here in Ezekiel 1 is that what's depicted is that the people who've been carried off into exile are having a vision, or at least one of them, Ezekiel the prophet, is having a vision of God's mobility. Now this ark, which has been stuck in the temple since the time of David, the mobility of God's been de-emphasized. The stability of God has been emphasized for generations, for hundreds of years. That God is with the monarchy, the Davidic monarchy, that God is with the city of Jerusalem, and that God is working primarily in and within Judah. That's been the message for centuries. And then all that's gone. And what we see here is God moving through a wilderness, which reminds us of the Exodus journey and the wandering of the wilderness and the tabernacle traditions, that God is okay living in a desolate area. God's okay wandering through the wilderness. God's done it before. God will do it again. And that God is going to fly to be with God's people in the wilderness, in the exile, right? This is something similar to what Jeremiah said. Jeremiah said God's already planned a future for you, but Ezekiel's getting at it a different way. You can see his priestly tradition coming out very richly through this theology. He's remembering an ancient theology of God's mobility, and he's emphasizing that moment and reminding the people of this image, this symbol, this thing that used to be at the core of their religion that they've basically forgotten about. And you can see this idea that God's mobility and God's stability are two kind of opposite poles, right? And they're in a bit of tension. Is God mobile or is God stable? Is God leading us to change and move into the wilderness, or is God telling us to find a safe place to be? Maybe God's doing both of those things at the same time for different groups of people. And we can even kind of think about kind of moving back and forth in time between these two options, right? Between these two, it's not that one of them's better than the other necessarily, right? All of us want something of stability in our lives for our children, think about, right? But also, all of us realize that there are things that need to change. There are things that need to move, right? There's ways that God needs to be on the move or mobile or moving around. And that stability can be temptation in a way. So all to say that this theology that we see here in Ezekiel 1 is richly drawing from these ancient Israelite traditions that are associated with the priestly symbolic world or theological world. And we're going to see this continue throughout the book of Ezekiel. Just as a brief continuation here. So here is Ezekiel 1 through 3, this idea of the mobile throne. I'm going to talk about chapters 2 and 3 in just a second, but just to foreshadow, Ezekiel 8 through 11 is the second time we'll see this same kind of mobile ark throne return, the Ark 2.0. And then what Ezekiel will watch there in chapters 8 through 11 is the destruction of Jerusalem. So where was God in that? That's what Ezekiel will be talking about there. And Ezekiel 40 through 48 depicts the mobile throne returning to Jerusalem, a new Jerusalem. It's not actually called Jerusalem anymore in Ezekiel 40 through 48, but there's a new temple, and God returns there. It's a vision of the future. So you can see this kind of arc, right? Some people have called this the ark, right? The Ark of the Covenant, arc, like A-R-C, like a story arc, right? The arc of the plot. So the arc in the book of Ezekiel, God being willing to move, God needing to move, God needing to return, and the promise of God's return one day. We can think of this as kind of like a cycle that we all live through, that every community lives through, that every country lives through, right? This kind of like cycle of stability, instability or destabilizing, right? And then stability once more again in a new way, in a different way. So in chapter 2, Ezekiel has a vision of a scroll. This is kind of like Jeremiah chapter 1, where God touches Jeremiah's mouth and says, I'm going to give you some words to say, but this is different. God gives Ezekiel a scroll and says, eat this stuff. Now, the scroll has some kind of like terrible stuff on it, condemnations of terrible things that are happening in Judah and in Jerusalem, but also of dire warnings of terrible things that will happen if they don't change their ways. But it's all written on this scroll, and Ezekiel takes it, and God says, eat this thing. And so he eats it, and it says it tastes like honey, even though it's got these awful prophecies on it. God's word is so rich and delicious that it tastes wonderful, even when it's confusing to us, and even when it says things that don't sit right with us, right? That are difficult for us to take. I think that's kind of the message there. But it's important here too to see that it's a scroll that Ezekiel gets. Ezekiel is we're gonna see over the next few weeks that Ezekiel is very different from Jeremiah. Remember, Jeremiah had a guy named Baruch who did his writing for him, right? He outsourced his scribal skills, right? Ezekiel, probably in the line for the high priest, he would have been able to write and read, and we can see that the writing and reading aspect. I mean, we'll see later on. Ezekiel writes these really long parables and allegories and even sermons and things like this. He's going to change the way that ancient Israelites think about prophecy, and he's going to change the way they think about scripture. They didn't really have scripture, I don't think, in the same way before Ezekiel. And then when people come back from exile, like when Ezra comes back from exile, he brings with him a Torah, a written Torah that is basically the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, and he reads it to the people, and now they have like a full law that's a kind of compiled. There's some things that'll be added to it later and so on, but nonetheless, all to say that we're seeing a longer trajectory of a change in the way that ancient Israelites deal and relate to God. That you don't have to wait for a prophet to hear a word from God anymore. It's going to be written. And anyone who can engage this either in written form or in oral form is going to be able to engage God. God is going to be a God of the text after this. So then we finish this vision of the glory of God. And in chapter 3, verse 12, we return to that vision of the wheels within wheels. And there's this kind of loud sound and so on. For 7 days, Ezekiel can't speak. And then God says, you're going to be like a sentry, like a sentinel. So chapter 3, verses 16 through 21, it sums up a big moral teaching of the book of Ezekiel, which is if you find yourself in exile, maybe you didn't deserve being there, but your future is in a way dependent on yourself. In other words, don't blame where you are today on your ancestors being wicked, which is maybe a temptation from some of the Israelites that find themselves in the exile. Instead of doing that, take responsibility for your life. This is a message that Ezekiel gives. I'm going to get more in the details that this message can be abused or it can be used well. Like any moral, ethical message, there's two sides to it. So if you tell the wrong person this message, it can hurt them. I'll get more to this later because Ezekiel has a whole sermon on this in chapter 18 where he fleshes this out in great detail. But then in chapter 3, verse 22, he's supposed to go over to the river Kibar, and he sees the glory there that he had seen by the river Kibar, and he falls on his face. Or he went to Valley, and he saw that same glory that is this kind of wheels within wheels thing. And then God says, I'm going to shut your mouth. I'm going to make it so you can't speak for a long time. And perhaps this happens until chapter 24. So Ezekiel has to write, but then he also has to kind of do things, act things out. And so we're going to actually see this next session. We're going to talk about chapters 8 through 11 and 40 through 48. But then we're going to return to these sign acts. What does Ezekiel do when he can't speak? That's chapters 4 and 5. You may have seen some of these where he makes like little clay models of things and stuff like that. It's a fascinating way. He ends up acting out his prophecies, a bit like street theater or something like that, which is a really fascinating way for Ezekiel to perform his ministry. Well, I've left you with too much information today, I know, but we're going to come back to these points over and over again as we explore more of the book of Ezekiel. But if I can leave you with something, just try to think about that kind of tension between God's mobility and God's stability. And perhaps you've been feeling some of that over this past year, some of that tension, but also some of that promise. Peace be with you.